Hello and welcome to On the Sunny Side, a new digital TV format by the German-speaking edition of Forbes on the F15 YouTube channel. I'm Sunny Greneveld. I'm an entrepreneur and a Forbes Under 30 list maker. And every week on Thursday, I meet executives, researchers, entrepreneurs, and thinkers who are helping us understand how the digital economy works, how to drive it forward, and how to make sure that we use technology for good. Now, this week's guest is Dr. Christian Busch. He's the author of the Serendipity Mindset. He's the director of the Global Economy Program at NYU at New York University. And he's a co-founder of the Sandbox Network and Leaders on Purpose. Welcome, Christian, to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
So for everybody who tunes in regularly, they know I always start with something called Sunny's Fast Five. It's 5 questions which essentially try to get to know the guest a little bit better, but the answers need to be fast. They need to be in just one sentence. So would you be ready for that?
Let's give it a shot.
All right. Easy starters. Are you a morning or a night person?
A night person turned into a morning person.
If I gave you a time machine and you could travel any place, any episode, where would you go?
I think to the old Greeks, like, hanging out with Socrates, talking about the big questions of life. And
I would actually be down to join for that. I'd be curious about it. So I guess the next question ties right into that. What is something you are learning right now in the present?
That building a muscle for uncertainty is really depending on context, and that at the moment there's a lot of opportunity, of potentiality that we can't even grasp yet.
What is success for you?
It's very related, I think, to the liberty and the freedom to enable meaningful ideas to happen.
If you could explain your 300 plus pages of work that you wrote to the Serendipity Mindset, which came out on June 9th, how would you explain it into a sentence?
Essentially, that usually we a lot of times assume that luck just happens to us, that it's passive, but actually that it can be an active process that we can influence. So essentially we can build a muscle for the unexpected that turns it into positive outcomes. So
serendipity is something that, before reading your book, I would have also said happens to us. How does it become something active? How does it become a mindset?
Well, it's fascinating because if you think about it, so maybe a scenario that all of us know in terms of, let's say you go into a coffee shop and you sit next to that person and you accidentally spill that coffee, you look up and you sense that kind of connection, right? Where you're like, oh my God, this could be someone who could be interesting. But then you just say, oh, I'm so sorry. And then you forget about it. And then you walk out and you're like, oh, damn it. Like if I would have talked with this person, what could have been, right? So this kind of unexpected thing that happened, spilling the coffee, was almost like a trigger, an excuse to do something with it. And we could have done something with it. We could have talked with the person, connected dots in some way or the other, but we didn't. And so what I'm really fascinated by is how these kind of active things unfold in terms of that. Usually when we think about luck, we think about, if you inherit something or these kind of things, we can't influence them, right? This is just blind luck. But the smart luck that serendipity is all about is to say, there is something unexpected happening, but then we have to connect the dots. And so to give you an example, if you think about that in a company context, there's this Chinese company I've been doing a lot of work with, and they at some point had farmers call them up and they would say, the farmers would say, well, we're trying to wash our potatoes in your washing machine and it always breaks down. Why does it break down? It's such a crappy machine. And so what would we usually do as a white goods company? We would say, well, don't wash your potatoes in the washing machine. It's not made for that, right? They did the opposite. They said, well, it's unexpected that they wash their potatoes there. But you know what? There's a lot of farmers in China. So why don't we build in a dirt filter and make it a potato washing machine? Right, which then became like a nice selling product. The point here is that if you think about it, like it's our reaction to that unexpectedness that then defines if we can say, oh, there's some nice positive outcome like innovation, like love, like success in general, but it really depends on how we go about it.
So how do I cultivate such a mindset then?
I mean, that's literally 300 pages, but I think
we have 15 minutes, Kristen.
But if there's a couple of small steps, I mean, what I'm a big fan of small behavioral changes. So small things in the day-to-day that we can all do, even like on Zoom calls or like wherever we are at the moment. So to give you an example, one thing is, because Serendipity is so much about connecting dots, it's so much about putting something out there that we can connect, right? So, you know, this dreaded question, for example, when you meet a new person, like let's say at a digital conference or something, and they ask you, what do you do, right? Like usually it puts us into a box, but there's one approach. So Ollie Barrett in London uses that, as he's an amazing entrepreneur there. When you would ask him, what do you do? He would say, well, you know, I'm an education entrepreneur, but I've also recently explored philosophy, but what I'm really excited about is playing the piano. And what he does here is he sets three potential hooks, three hooks where you could potentially connect something with and say, oh my God, such a coincidence. Like I just started a philosophy club, or, oh my God, such a coincidence. I just started hosting matinees. The point is we give them some kind of excuse to do something with it. Same of how we ask questions, right? Do we ask something like, what do you do? Or do we ask things like, what's on your mind? What gets you excited at the moment? And so I think there's a lot of these kind of small behavioral changes, but we can also put that into the company context in terms of rituals, in terms of how, if we start meetings, do we maybe ask something like, you know, what surprised you last week? Was there something unexpected, like farmers calling up and telling us that the product doesn't work, that we can then turn into something? So it's really kind of opening our mind to it first and foremost, but then there's a lot of other practices we can build on this in terms of how we can really like develop a mind for it. But the first step really is about starting to see it and then try to like, to literally, it's almost like you have to start seeing it happen so that it happens more, because you start believing that it can happen.
So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way.
You know, there's a fascinating experiment around this actually. They did that in the UK, where they took one person who self-identifies as extremely lucky and one person who self-identifies as extremely unlucky, and they told them, walk down the streets, go into a coffee shop, order a coffee and sit down. That's it. What they don't tell them is that there's hidden cameras across the street. There's a £5 note in front of the coffee shop. And then inside the coffee shop, there's only one free seat. And that free seat is this next to this extremely successful businessman who can make all the dreams in the world happen. Now, the lucky person walks down the street, sees the £5 note, picks it up. And lucky in terms of like, you know, it would be someone who says, oh, I always have good things happen. And the unlucky person, oh, bad things always happen to me and stuff. So the lucky person sees the £5 note, picks it up, goes into the coffee shop, orders the coffee, has a nice conversation, sits next to that businessman, like starts a wonderful conversation, exchanges business cards in the end. We don't know if an opportunity comes out of it, but it wouldn't be unexpected, right? The unlucky person walks down the street, steps over the £5 note, goes inside the shop, orders the coffee, sits next to the businessman, the other person's left, ignores the businessman, and that's it. Now, at the end of the day, they ask both of them, like, how was your day? Like, what happened? And so the lucky person says, well, it was amazing. You know, I made 2 new friends. I found money in the street, and we don't know if an opportunity came out of it, but it wouldn't be unexpected, right? The unlucky person just says, well, nothing really happened. And, you know, I think we've all seen this in our lives, right? That people have exactly the same situation they're in, but some people just seem a bit luckier than others. And our research, for example, which is a lot about CEOs and like how CEOs create success, a lot of times they intuitively cultivate serendipity. They set themselves up for those kind of situations.
Technology is ever more a powerful connector. And I think we've all noticed this during COVID-19, where so much of our connections, whether we liked it or not, in some cases, had to start to happen online, be it in an organization, be it in private life. What is a technology which is really designed or helpful in fostering serendipity?
I'm a big fan of everything that allows something kind of random collision types. So let's say you're in a big company like Google or so. And one of the things that they've been doing is to say, okay, let's randomly pair up people within an organization for like a random coffee or like for a random lunch. And like, hey, you could build in like 3 inspirational questions. You could say, ask each other, like, what's on your mind? What challenges are you facing? And then, you know, just talk about it and see what comes out of it. And so what happens here is that in a way, you know, the beauty of serendipity that is currently kind of completely shut down in a lot of contexts is that it gives us that meaning that there's meaningful things that could happen any moment. And this kind of joy that comes from, oh my God, such a coincidence this, or oh my God, this and this. And so by putting people into, in a way, giving them an excuse to randomly talk with a stranger about something meaningful and pre-selecting them in some kind of way, right? Maybe they're on the same level in the company, whatever it is, but they don't know each other yet. And so I like these kind of things where you don't even need a particular technology for it. You literally just take a list of employees and you say, Martin will talk with Petra, and they don't know each other yet, and we give them an hour and we just go for it, and there's nothing on it. So I think everything that has these collisions, and the same at conferences, right? You have conferences now that have started to do like 2-minute encounters of people where they literally, you are in a room and then for 2 minutes they randomly break two people into like almost like a speed dates kind of constellation with 1 or 2 inspirational questions. And it's amazing how much it does if the questions are framed the right way. If there's no proper prompt, then people feel it's awkward. Then it's like, oh, like, you know, a lot of us are closet introverts, including myself, right? I don't like to be just thrown into a context. But if I have like meaningful questions, if I have like a meaningful excuse to just ask you, hey, like, you know, what is exciting for you at the moment, then I get excited about it, right? Because I have some kind of excuse to do that. And so I think like building that in, you know, when we have Zoom calls, like pairing people up or having kind of speed, like 3-minute type conversations about something inspiring can be super helpful to cultivate this, but also to just get excited again that like, you know, we need to, even if we're the most routine type person, we need a little bit that feeling, right? That there's something more out there. And so that gives us a bit of that feeling.
You're someone who's so widely read. You're a researcher. You're working with CEOs, with leaders on purpose. You're doing so many different things. What's a book or a piece of research that you've come across beyond the ones that you've mentioned that you think really helps people better understand the digital world? Maybe also this idea of how to bring serendipity into it, something that you found curious at this intersection of the digital world and serendipity.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple. So I think like on the macro level, Tarakana's work around like connectography and so is really interesting because he's mapping the world in terms of different types of like networks and then trying to understand that. So I think from a mindset perspective, that's interesting. But I think like if there's like, I like one organization that has inspired me extremely and where there's a lot of write-ups about them is Reconstructed Living Labs. And so it's former drug addicts and drug dealers and others in Cape Flats in sub-Saharan Africa in Cape Town. And I've done a lot of work in that kind of context. And what's fascinating in that context is how this is the roughest context you can imagine, right? We think we are in a rough environment at the moment. They've been living in like an extremely rough environment for their whole life. And so what I found fascinating about them is how they've been reframing constantly. Like they essentially, so for example, when they go into a community, they don't say, what budget do we need? Or like, what resources do we need? They say, what do we already have here? Oh, wonderful. We have an old garage. That's a training center. We have a former drug dealer. Fantastic. That's like a potential entrepreneur. And so essentially by reframing this, what you're doing is you're getting away from this idea of like the world is breaking down, everything's going down the drain, and we don't have the budget we need to how can we rethink creatively what is already here? And then if you're a bank, for example, instead of just saying, oh, we have to like let like 5,000 people go now because we don't need cashiers anymore, you would say, well, a cashier could be a potential financial trainer. And maybe we don't have to close down the office space here because that could be a financial training center. And then during COVID, something happens like a brewery becomes a hand sanitizer company or a design company becomes like a mask company because people are reframing their capabilities. And I think that's where a lot of excitement for me comes, that I think it's a tough period. I'm here in New York where people around me have been dying. I had COVID. It was a really rough period. But like when we will be looking back in 10 years from now, we will see that a lot of interesting things will be coming out of exactly this period because it forces us to be more creative. And so I think I see a lot of hope in that moment, actually.
How are you doing? I had no idea that you had COVID and that you were personally so much at the center in a way of some of these challenges. How are you?
Well, it was interesting because, you know, a lot of my life has been shaped by near-death experience, like having a car crash early on in life and so on. And that was quite a, like almost like a reminder of that. And I mean, for 1.5 weeks, I would, wake up like at night and like not being able to breathe, 911 on speed dial, these kind of things. So it was a like bad thing. But at that time, they would be like, oh, don't come into the hospital because if it's not that, you might infect yourself. And so New York at that point was just a really bad place to be when you have COVID. But I think again, like what it told me was, I reread again my favorite book, Viktor Frankl's Search for Meaning, and like it really kind of brought back the point of like, how do you find meaning in crisis? So even if you're in this kind of really bad period, how can you still try to figure out what is a kind of meaning in this? And to me, it has been a beautiful reorientation, I think, towards a bit more the things I'm most excited about versus cutting off a couple of other things where people were like, yeah, you know what, like life can be short. So like, why would I bother with this? And so I think it was a nice kind of refocusing of the things I really care about.
What is, in closing, your parting advice to anyone who's watched this conversation till this very point?
It's almost, I mean, I'm from Germany, so I have a very low risk tolerance in terms of like when I grew up, like, and I'm used to plans and I want to kind of put things out there and everything else. And one of the things why I've become so joyful about serendipity is that for me it has been a wonderful way to limit anxiety about things that I can't control, to limit anxiety about the uncertain, the unexpected, and to almost see it as like, reframe it as like, oh my God, like in every moment that doesn't go the way I planned it, there's a beautiful thing in there that could still work out. And when I look back on my life now, the coolest things, the most important things, the most meaningful things, all my ventures, everything that I've ever been involved in, I think that has been meaningful, came out of like some kind of moment of like crisis or some kind of like, this didn't work out, but then XYZ worked out. And so I think it's really, to me, this kind of potentiality that is in the uncertain, because so many different things can happen. And just because we assume that our life as we had it before COVID was the perfect life or a good life, you know what, like maybe it's also now an experimentation frame that allows us to see maybe there's other lives we could also live. And so I think, I'm very kind of into the idea of really seeing the unexpected as a beautiful pathway potentially towards more joyful and meaningful lives, and really seeing it more as this and less as, oh my God, my life is going down the drain now, and which it is for some people. And I think that is kind of the uncontrollable things, but I think the things we can control. If I would wrap it up in one sentence, I would really bring it back to Viktor Frankl and like this idea that in our response to the unexpected, that's where our freedom is. And like, that's where like we can really create things and serendipity and success. And I think that's kind of really focusing on this, what we can control versus like what we can't control. I think that's kind of where the beauty of serendipity lies.
Christian, it's been such a pleasure, and I'm so grateful you're back and healthy, and that we were able to have this conversation. It's just been incredibly inspirational. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It was great to be here and to be part of your wonderful podcast.
So here on the sunny side, it'll continue at 5:30 p.m. with Editor-in-Chief of Forbes, Klaus Fiala, and his show, The Greatest Business Minds. I look forward to welcoming all of you back at 4 p.m. every Thursday on the Forbes 15 YouTube channel. Thank you so much, and see you soon next week on the sunny side.